I didn't know it then, but that night was the last time I would sit in that room and pretend everything was fine. The console hummed beside us, low and steady, the kind of white noise you stop hearing after a while. The screen glowed pale blue against the walls, casting long shadows that stretched across the carpet and disappeared into the corners. We'd been playing for hours. Or maybe we hadn't. Time felt strange that night, elastic, like it had stopped matching the way it used to. Jonah sat beside me on the couch. The same couch I'd had since my mid-20s, back when I thought buying furniture meant I was becoming someone real. The fabric was worn thin in places, the cushions sagging where we always sat. His leg was close to mine, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat between us. I told myself I wasn't thinking about it. I told myself a lot of things that night. The match ended. I don't remember who won. Jonah didn't lean forward to start another round. He didn't reach for his controller. He just sat there, his body angled slightly toward me, and I felt his eyes before I saw them. I kept staring at the screen, watching the idle animation loop on the menu. A character standing alone in an empty arena, waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. He said my name. Just once. Adrian. Quiet, like he was testing the weight of it. I turned my head, and there he was, looking at me the way people do in movies before everything changes. It wasn't playful. It wasn't teasing. It was something else, something I didn't have a name for but recognized instantly, the way you recognize the smell of rain before it starts to fall. I should have looked away. I should have laughed it off, made a joke, grabbed my phone, and checked the time like I suddenly remembered I had somewhere to be. But I didn't. I just sat there, holding the controller in my lap like it could anchor me to something normal, something safe. My heart was beating too fast. I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips. The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago. Jonah didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable, and I realized with a kind of slow, sinking certainty that this moment had been building for weeks. Maybe longer. Maybe since the day he walked back into my life, and I let him. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Elise was asleep. The kids were asleep. Everything I had built, everything I had convinced myself I wanted, was resting peacefully above me. And here I was, sitting in the dark with a man whose presence made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. I wanted to move. I wanted to stand up, turn off the console, tell him it was late, and we should call it a night. I wanted to do what I always did, step back, shut it down, return to the version of myself that made sense. But I didn't move. I just sat there, looking at him, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd been running from. The game wasn't the reason he'd come over. I think I'd known that from the start. I am 38 years old. I have been married to Elise for 12 years. We have 2 children, Maya, who is 9, and Carson, who just turned 7. We live in a house with pale gray siding and a front yard that I mow every Sunday morning when the weather allows. There is a swing set in the back that I assembled myself 3 summers ago, following instructions that made no sense until I'd already made several mistakes. The house has 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a basement that smells faintly of old carpet and the particular mustiness that comes from being underground. This is my life. I can describe it in details like these, clean and factual, the way you describe a house you were trying to sell. But I've learned that facts don't tell you very much about what it feels like to live inside something. I work in IT support for a small firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows you. I fix computers, reset passwords, explain to people over the phone why their email isn't working. It's steady work. It pays well enough. It requires almost nothing of me except patience and the ability to sound helpful even when I'm not feeling particularly generous. I've been there for 6 years. Before that, I worked somewhere similar. Before that, somewhere else. The jobs blurred together because they were never meant to be destinations. They were just places to land while life happened around them. Elise works part-time at a dental office. She handles scheduling, insurance claims, the kind of administrative work that keeps a small practice running. She's good at it. She's good at most things, organized, dependable, the person people turn to when something needs to be done right. She keeps our lives in order. The kids' activities, the bills, the calendar on the fridge that maps out our weeks in different colored markers. I don't know what I'd do without her. I tell her that sometimes, and I mean it, but I wonder if she hears the strange emptiness in my voice when I say it. Our weekends follow rhythms we established years ago without ever discussing them. Saturday mornings are for groceries. We go together, the four of us, pushing a cart through familiar aisles while Maya asks for things we don't need and Carson trails behind, dragging his feet. Saturday afternoons are for errands, for yard work, for catching up on whatever we didn't finish during the week. Saturday nights we sometimes watch a movie together, the kids sprawled on the floor with bowls of popcorn, Elise beside me on the couch. She leans into me during the quiet parts. I put my arm around her because that's what I'm supposed to do. Sundays are slower. Church in the morning, though I've stopped pretending I get anything out of it. Elise still finds comfort there, in the hymns and the routine, and I don't argue. Afterward, we have lunch, often at her parents' house or sometimes at the diner near the highway where the waitress knows our order. The afternoons dissolve into homework and laundry and preparing for the week ahead. Dinner is at 6. We eat together at the table, no phones allowed. This was Elise's rule, and I agreed because it seemed like the kind of thing good parents do. The house is full of photographs. They line the hallway leading upstairs, arranged in frames that Elise picked out, and I hung carefully, measuring twice so they'd be level. Our wedding day. A vacation to the beach when Maya was still small enough to carry. Carson's first day of kindergarten. Holiday cards from years past. If you walked through our home, you'd see a life that looked complete. Happy even. I look at those photographs sometimes and barely recognize the man in them. He's smiling. He has his arm around his wife. He looks like someone who knows what he's doing. At night, after the kids are in bed and Elise has finished whatever she's working on, I go down to the basement. It started innocently enough. I told Elise I needed a space to unwind, somewhere I could decompress after long days. She didn't object. She understood, or at least she said she did. So I brought my old console down there, the one I'd had since college, and hooked it up to the oversized television we replaced a few years ago, but couldn't bring ourselves to throw out. Sometimes Elise joins me. She'll sit beside me for a round or two, laughing when she loses, teasing me when she wins. But more often, she doesn't. She has her own routines upstairs, a book she's reading, a show she follows, the small luxuries of quiet after the kids are asleep. I tell myself it's fine. I tell myself everyone needs space. But the truth is, I've started to prefer the nights when she doesn't come down. The nights when I can sit alone in the dim light, the glow of the screen washing over me, and pretend I'm somewhere else. That's where I was the night Jonah reappeared. Alone in the basement, playing games I'd played 100 times before, trying to fill the hours between dinner and sleep with something that felt like living. I didn't know he was about to walk back into my life. I didn't know that everything I'd carefully constructed was about to shift, that the routines I'd relied on would suddenly feel like walls instead of shelter. I was 38 years old. I had a wife, 2 children, a house with a mortgage that would take another 20 years to pay off. I had a job that asked nothing of me and a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what I was supposed to want. And beneath it all, there was a restlessness I couldn't name. A feeling that I was living someone else's story, reading lines someone else had written, waiting for a scene that was never going to come. Then Jonah sent me a message, and everything I thought I'd settled started to crack open. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my desk at work, halfway through a ticket about a printer that wouldn't connect to the network, when my phone lit up with a notification. A friend request. I glanced at the name and felt something shift in my chest, a small jolt of recognition that traveled through me before I could stop it. Jonah Reyes. I hadn't spoken to him in over 15 years. We'd been inseparable once, back when we were teenagers who thought the world was smaller than it turned out to be. We spent entire summers in his basement, controllers in our hands, losing track of time until his mother called down that it was past midnight and I needed to go home. We made plans the way kids do, certain and absolute. We'd stay friends forever. We'd move to the same city after college. We'd figure out life together, whatever that meant. But life didn't work that way. I went to college 2 states over. He stayed closer to home, drifting between jobs, between apartments, between versions of himself I stopped recognizing. We talked less, then barely at all, then not at all. The friendship didn't end with an argument or a betrayal. It just faded, the way most things do when you stop putting effort into keeping them alive. I stared at the friend request for longer than I should have. My finger hovered over the screen. I could have ignored it. I could have declined. I could have left it sitting there, unanswered, and gone back to my work. But I didn't. I accepted. And a few minutes later, another notification appeared. Got my old console working. Remember those nights? You owe me a rematch. I read the message 3 times. It was casual, almost throwaway, the kind of thing you send to someone when you're testing the waters, seeing if they'll respond. I could have left it on read. I could have replied with something vague and noncommittal, the digital equivalent of a polite nod. Instead, I wrote back, I think you're the one who owes me. Pretty sure I won the last match. His response came quickly. Convenient memory. Guess we'll have to settle it. That was it. That was all it took. A handful of messages exchanged during a slow afternoon at work, and suddenly I was thinking about him in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. I found myself checking my phone more often, waiting for the next notification. We talked about small things at first. The games we used to play, mutual friends we'd lost touch with, the strange feeling of looking back at your younger self and wondering where all that time went. Then, a week later, he asked if he could stop by. Just for a weekend, he wrote. Passing through town. Would be good to see you. I should have said no. I should have told him I was busy, that weekends were for family, that it had been too long and too much had changed. But I didn't. I told him sure. I told him it would be good to catch up. I told Elise that an old friend was coming to visit, someone from high school, and she smiled and said that sounded nice. She asked if he needed a place to stay. I said no, he'd probably get a hotel. She didn't press. When Jonah arrived that Friday evening, standing on my porch with a six-pack in one hand and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, I felt 15 years collapse in an instant. He looked older, of course. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tiredness in his face that came from living a certain kind of life. But his smile was the same. That crooked, easy smile that always made it seem like he knew something you didn't. He said my name like a question. Adrian. I nodded. It's me. He laughed, stepping forward, and pulled me into a hug that lasted just long enough to feel strange. When he stepped back, his eyes moved over me, taking in the suburban uniform I'd adopted without realizing it. The button-down shirt, the wedding ring, the house behind me with its gray siding and tidy landscaping. You look good, he said, like you've got it all figured out. I told him I didn't, but I think we both knew I was lying. Elise was kind to him. She always is with guests. She offered him dinner, asked about his drive, made small talk about his life with the practiced ease of someone who's good at making people feel welcome. Jonah was charming in return, answering her questions without offering too much, deflecting attention back to her, to the kids, to the life we'd built. I watched them talk and felt like I was observing from a distance, like I was watching actors in a play I'd written but didn't remember writing. After dinner, after the kids went to bed, after Elise excused herself with a tired smile and said she'd leave us to catch up, Jonah and I went down to the basement. He looked around, taking in the old couch, the console, the shelves lined with games I barely touched anymore. He said it felt like stepping back in time. I told him that was the idea. We played for hours that first night. It was easy, slipping back into the old rhythm. The trash talk, the competition, the comfortable silence between matches. We drank the beer he'd brought, and when that ran out, I went upstairs and grabbed 2 more from the fridge. Elise was already asleep. The house was quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, staring at the calendar on the fridge with its color-coded schedule, and felt a strange pull I couldn't name. When I went back downstairs, Jonah had paused the game. He was leaning back on the couch, his head tilted toward the ceiling, eyes half closed. He looked at me when I handed him the beer and said thanks. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. I missed this. I missed you. I didn't know what to say. I sat down beside him, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and told him I missed it too. I meant the games, the late nights, The simplicity of being young and thinking that was all that mattered. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was really what I meant. The weekend stretched. Jonah's hotel reservation, if it ever existed, went unmentioned. He slept on the couch in the basement. Elise didn't seem to mind. She said it was nice that I had someone to spend time with, that I seemed more relaxed than I had in months. I didn't tell her that relaxed wasn't the word, that what I felt was something closer to unraveling. We fell into a routine. Days were normal. Work, family dinners, the usual choreography of domestic life. But the nights belonged to us. After everyone else went to bed, Jonah and I would sit in the basement, controllers in hand, and talk the way we used to. He told me about the years I'd missed, the cities he'd lived in, the jobs he'd quit, the relationships that hadn't worked out. He talked about men he'd loved quietly, carefully, never quite finding a place where he could be fully himself. He spoke about loneliness in a way that made it sound like a country he'd been traveling through for years. I listened. I didn't share much in return. What was there to say? That I'd done everything right and still felt wrong? That I'd built the life I was supposed to want and couldn't shake the feeling that I was living it for someone else. The nights blurred together. 1, then 2, then 3. The weekend became a week. Jonah never mentioned leaving. I never mentioned him staying. It was easier not to name it. Easier to let it exist in the undefined space between intention and accident. But something was building. I felt it in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. In the way his hand would brush mine when he passed me a controller. In the way the silence between us grew heavier, like it was holding something neither of us was ready to release. Elise started asking questions. Small ones at first. If I was tired. If everything was okay. If maybe Jonah should think about heading out soon so we could get back to normal. I told her everything was fine. I told her Jonah would leave when he was ready. I told her I was just enjoying the nostalgia, that it wasn't often you got to reconnect with someone from that far back. She believed me. Or she pretended to. I'm still not sure which. And then came the night I described at the beginning. The night when the game ended and Jonah didn't reach for the controller. The night he said my name and looked at me like he was asking a question I'd been avoiding my entire life. The night when I finally understood that this wasn't about nostalgia. It had never been about the games. It was about him. It was about me. It was about the truth I'd buried so deep I'd convinced myself it didn't exist. The transformation didn't announce itself. It crept in slowly, the way fog moves across a field in the early morning, until suddenly you realize you can't see more than a few feet ahead. Jonah had been staying with us for nearly 2 weeks, and what had started as a weekend visit had become something else entirely. Something unnamed. Something I was afraid to examine too closely. We had patterns now. Rituals. After dinner, after the kids finished their homework and Elise settled into her evening routine upstairs, Jonah and I would disappear into the basement. The console became our excuse, our cover story, the acceptable reason for 2 grown men to spend hours together in the dim light. We'd play a match or 2, but more often than not, the controllers would end up forgotten on the coffee table, and we'd just talk. He told me things he said he'd never told anyone. About the apartment he'd lived in 3 years ago in Portland, where he'd fallen in love with a man who worked at the coffee shop downstairs. How they'd been together for 8 months before the man's family found out, and he'd ended it without warning, leaving Jonah with a lease he couldn't afford and a heartbreak he didn't know how to carry. About the years he spent in Seattle after that, working construction during the day and spending his nights in bars where he could be himself, or at least a version of himself that felt closer to true. He talked about loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling like you're speaking a language no one else understands. He described it as living in a house with all the lights on, but no one home. I understood what he meant more than I wanted to admit. I listened to him the way you listen to music that speaks to something deep inside you, something you didn't know needed to be heard. I asked questions. I let the silence between his words stretch out, giving him space to find what he wanted to say next. And somewhere in all of that, I started to feel the walls I'd built around myself beginning to crack. There were moments that should have been nothing. Moments that in any other context, with any other person, would have passed by unnoticed. But with Jonah, they accumulated. They built on each other like stones in a cairn, marking a path I couldn't unsee. His hand brushing mine when he passed me a beer. The way it lingered for half a second longer than necessary, his fingers warm against my knuckles. The way he laughed at something I said and leaned closer, his shoulder pressing against mine, and didn't move away. The way he looked at me sometimes when I was focused on the game, his gaze steady and patient, like he was waiting for me to notice something I'd been deliberately ignoring. I started paying attention to things I'd trained myself not to see. The way his voice changed when he said my name, softer somehow, like it meant something more than just identification. The way he'd stretch out on the couch, his legs extending into the space between us, casual but deliberate. The way he'd ask me questions about my life that no one else bothered to ask anymore. Not what I did for work or how the kids were doing in school, but whether I was happy. Whether I still thought about the future the way we used to when we were young. Whether I ever felt like I was living the wrong life. I deflected most of those questions. I gave answers that sounded true enough, but didn't reveal anything real. But he kept asking. Gentle, persistent, like he knew I was hiding and wanted to give me permission to stop. During the days, I tried to maintain normalcy. I went to work. I sat in my cubicle and fixed other people's problems and pretended mine didn't exist. But I was distracted. My supervisor mentioned it during a meeting. Said I seemed somewhere else lately. Asked if everything was okay at home. I told him yes. I told him I was just tired. He nodded and moved on, and I was grateful he didn't push. At home, I went through the motions. I helped Maya with her math homework, sitting beside her at the kitchen table while she worked through problems about fractions and percentages. I played catch with Carson in the backyard, throwing the ball back and forth until the sun started to set and Elise called us in for dinner. I kissed my wife when I came through the door. I asked about her day. I listened to her talk about the office drama, the difficult patients, the scheduling conflicts that made her job harder than it needed to be. But even while I was doing all of this, part of me was somewhere else. Part of me was already in the basement, waiting for the moment when the rest of the house went quiet and it would just be us again. Jonah and me. The glow of the screen. The weight of everything we weren't saying. Elise noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd been married to me long enough to recognize when I was present in body but absent in every other way. She started making small comments. Observations disguised as questions. She'd ask if I was feeling okay, if I was stressed about work, if maybe I needed to get more sleep. She suggested we go out for dinner one night, just the two of us, leave the kids with her parents. I agreed, and we did, and I tried to be the husband she deserved for those 2 hours. But even across the table from her, making conversation about safe topics and familiar territory, I could feel Jonah's presence like a song stuck in my head. A melody I couldn't stop humming. One evening, Elise came down to the basement. It was late, past 11, and Jonah and I were in the middle of a match. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, arms crossed, watching us. She didn't say anything at first, just watched. I paused the game. Jonah straightened up, suddenly aware that we'd been leaning toward each other, our legs nearly touching. She asked if we were planning to stay up all night. Her tone was light, but there was something underneath it, something that made my stomach tighten. I told her we'd be up soon. She looked at Jonah, then at me, and nodded. She said she just wanted to make sure we were okay down here. Then she went back upstairs. After she left, the energy in the room felt different. Heavier. Jonah asked if I thought she was upset. I told him no. I told him she was probably just tired. But I knew it was more than that. I knew she was starting to see something she didn't have words for yet. Something I'd been trying desperately not to name. The nights grew longer. We stopped pretending to care about the games. The controllers sat and used while we talked until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Jonah told me about the first time he kissed a man. He was 19, at a party where everyone was drunk enough not to care or remember. He said it felt like finally understanding a language he'd been hearing all his life, but never quite grasped. He asked me if I'd ever felt that way about anything. I didn't answer right away. I sat there, staring at the dark television screen, seeing my own reflection distorted and dim. Finally, I told him I didn't know. I told him I'd spent so long being what other people needed that I'd forgotten how to recognize what I needed. He said he understood. He said that was why he'd never settled down, never built the kind of life I had. Because he was afraid that if he did, he'd lose himself completely. He'd become someone unrecognizable. I wanted to tell him that I already was someone unrecognizable. That when I looked in the mirror some mornings, I saw a stranger wearing my face. That I'd built this life thinking it would make me feel whole, and instead it had made me feel like I was living in a play where everyone knew their lines except me. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, I just sat there beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, and let the silence hold what I couldn't speak. There was one night, about 3 weeks into his stay, when something almost happened. We'd been drinking more than usual. Not enough to be drunk, but enough to soften the edges, to make everything feel slightly unreal. We were sitting on the couch, no game playing, no conversation happening, just the two of us existing in the same space. Jonah shifted, turning his body toward mine. His knee pressed against my leg. His hand rested on the cushion between us, fingers splayed, close enough that I could see the lines in his palm. He said my name, Adrian, the way he'd said it that first night when everything started to change. I turned to look at him. His face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I could smell the beer on his breath. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest so hard I was sure he could hear it. He didn't move closer. He just stayed there, waiting, giving me the choice, giving me the space to decide what happened next. I wanted to kiss him. I wanted it so badly it felt like drowning. But I didn't. I pulled back, stood up, said something about needing water. I went upstairs, stood in the kitchen with my hands braced against the counter, and tried to remember how to breathe. When I came back down, Jonah was staring at the ceiling. He didn't look at me. He said maybe he should think about heading out soon, that he'd been imposing for too long, that I probably needed my space back. I told him he didn't have to leave. I told him he could stay as long as he wanted. And I meant it. Even though I knew that every day he stayed made it harder. Even though I knew I was letting something grow between us that I wouldn't be able to control much longer. He stayed. And the pattern continued. The nights in the basement. The conversations that went deeper than they should. The moments that accumulated like evidence I was trying to ignore. The way his presence had become the thing I looked forward to most. The thing that made me feel alive in a way nothing else did. I was caught. Not between two people, but between two versions of myself. The one who did what he was supposed to do, who honored his commitments and kept his promises and lived the safe, respectable life. And the one who sat in the basement with Jonah night after night, feeling something awaken inside him that he'd buried so long ago he'd forgotten it existed. I didn't know yet which version would win, but I was starting to understand that I couldn't be both forever. It happened on a Thursday night. I remember because Maya had a science project due the next day, and I'd spent the evening helping her glue together a model of the solar system while Carson watched cartoons in the next room. Elise had worked late, coming home exhausted and going straight to bed after a quick dinner. The house settled into its usual nighttime quiet. The kids were asleep by 9. By 10, I was alone. Jonah was in the basement already. I could hear the faint sound of the console through the floor, the familiar music from a game menu looping endlessly. I stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time before going down, my hand on the doorknob, my heart doing something strange in my chest. I knew, somehow, that this night was different, that whatever had been building between us for weeks was about to reach some kind of breaking point. When I got downstairs, Jonah was sitting on the couch, but he wasn't playing. The controller sat on the coffee table in front of him. The game was paused on the screen, frozen mid-action. He looked up when I came down the stairs, and something in his expression told me he'd been waiting. Not just for me to come down tonight, but for something larger. Something that had been approaching since the day he'd walked back into my life. I sat down beside him, not as close as we'd been sitting lately, but not as far apart as I should have. The distance between us felt deliberate, like we were both aware of it, both measuring it. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy, weighted with all the things we'd been circling around for weeks without ever landing on. I could hear the hum of the console, the distant sound of the refrigerator upstairs, my own breathing, too loud in my ears. Then Jonah turned toward me. Not his whole body, just his head, his shoulders, enough that I could feel the shift in his attention. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at me, really looking at me, the way he had that first night. Except now there was something else in his gaze. Something that looked like sadness mixed with hope. He said my name, Adrian. And this time it wasn't a question. It was something softer. An invitation, maybe, or a plea. I turned to face him. I made myself meet his eyes even though everything in me wanted to look away, to stand up, to find some excuse to break this moment before it became something I couldn't take back. His hand moved first, slowly, carefully, like he was giving me time to stop him. He reached out and rested it on my knee. Not grabbing, not pulling, just resting there. The weight of it was everything. It was the gentlest touch, but it felt like the world had shifted beneath me. I looked down at his hand, at his fingers against the fabric of my jeans, at the simple, impossible fact of him touching me in a way that meant something beyond casual contact. I could have moved away. I could have stood up. I could have laughed it off, made some joke, redirected us back to safe territory. But I didn't. I stayed exactly where I was. When I looked back up at him, his expression had changed. There was something raw in it now, something vulnerable. He looked like someone who'd been holding their breath for a very long time and was finally allowing himself to exhale. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at me, his hand still resting on my knee, and I felt the full weight of what was happening settle over us. This wasn't about nostalgia anymore. It wasn't about two old friends reconnecting. It was about something I'd been running from my entire adult life. Something I'd buried under years of choices and commitments and carefully constructed normalcy. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but every word landed with perfect clarity. I think you know why I came back. I think you've always known. My throat felt tight. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the words. Or maybe I could find them, but I was too afraid to speak them out loud. Because once I said them, once I acknowledged what was happening, there would be no way to pretend anymore. He kept going, his eyes never leaving mine. I spent 15 years trying to forget you, trying to move on, trying to find someone else who made me feel the way you did. And I couldn't. No matter where I went or who I met, there was always this part of me that belonged to you, to who we were, to who we could have been if either of us had been brave enough. I felt something crack open inside me. Some wall I'd been maintaining for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he'd built something up in his memory that had never really existed, that what we had was just friendship, just the closeness of youth before life complicated everything. But I couldn't, because it would have been a lie, and I was so tired of lying. He shifted closer. Not much, just a few inches, but it felt monumental. His hand moved from my knee to the space between us on the couch, palm up, an offering, an invitation. I looked at his hand, at the calluses on his fingers from years of construction work, at the scar across his thumb from some accident he'd probably told me about, but I couldn't remember, at the simple, devastating openness of him asking me for something without demanding it. I thought about Elise sleeping upstairs, about Maya and Carson in their beds, dreaming whatever children dream about the life I'd built that was supposed to be enough, about the man I'd convinced myself I was supposed to be. And then I thought about the basement where I spent my nights, about the restlessness that had lived in me for years, about the feeling of going through motions, of reading lines in a script I didn't write, about the way Jonah's presence had made me feel more awake, more alive, more real than I'd felt in longer than I could remember. My hand moved before I could stop it, before I could think about what it meant or what would come after. I reached out and placed my hand in his, palm to palm, fingers curling together. The moment our hands touched, really touched, something inside me broke. Or maybe it didn't break. Maybe it was something that had been locked away finally opening. I felt it all at once. Years of denial, of suppression, of telling myself that the person I was supposed to be was the same as the person I actually was. Jonah's fingers tightened around mine. Not hard, but firm, anchoring. His other hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and touched my face. just his fingertips against my jaw, tracing the line of it like he was memorizing something precious. I closed my eyes. I couldn't look at him anymore. It was too much, too real. If I kept looking, I'd have to acknowledge what was happening, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet, but even with my eyes closed, I could feel everything. The warmth of his hand in mine, the gentle touch of his fingers on my face, the way the air between us seemed to hum with something electric, something inevitable. He said my name again, Adrian, and this time it sounded like a prayer. I opened my eyes. He was so close now, close enough that I could see every detail of his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his lips were slightly parted, like he was about to say something but had forgotten how to speak. I knew what he wanted. I knew what he was asking without asking. And God help me, I wanted it too. I wanted to close the distance between us. I wanted to know what it felt like to stop pretending. I wanted to do what I should have done 15 years ago, before I'd convinced myself that wanting something made it wrong. But I didn't kiss him. Not that night. I couldn't. There was still too much weight on the other side of the scale. Too much I'd built that would come crashing down. Too many people who depended on me being the person I'd promised to be. So I just sat there, my hand in his fingers gentle against my face, and let myself feel it. All of it. The want, the fear, the grief for the life I might have lived if I'd been braver. The understanding that something had shifted irreversibly, that I could never unknow what I now knew. Jonah understood. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't demanding. He was just there, present, patient, giving me space to process what was happening inside me. After a long time, minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, he pulled his hand back from my face. But he didn't let go of my other hand. He held it there between us, a bridge across the space we'd been maintaining all these weeks. He said something then that I've never forgotten. Something that would echo in my mind during all the difficult days that came after. You don't have to decide anything tonight. You don't have to have all the answers. I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand why I came back. What this has been for me. I nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight, my chest too full of things I didn't have names for. He squeezed my hand once, gently, and then let go. The absence of his touch felt like cold water. Like waking up from a dream you weren't ready to leave. We sat there for the rest of the night, not touching, not speaking, just existing in the same space with this new understanding between us. The game stayed paused on the screen. The controllers stayed on the table. Dawn was starting to lighten the small basement window before either of us moved. But something had changed. Something irreversible. I'd spent my entire adult life building walls around a truth I couldn't face. And in one quiet moment, Jonah had shown me what was on the other side of those walls. And now that I'd seen it, now that I'd felt it, I didn't know how to go back to not knowing. The days after that night felt like living in two separate realities at once. In one, I was still Adrian the husband, Adrian the father, going through the familiar routines that had defined my life for over a decade. In the other, I was someone I didn't have a name for yet. Someone who had touched Jonah's hand in the dark and felt the ground shift beneath him. I couldn't reconcile the two. They existed side by side, overlapping, each one making the other feel less real. I went to work. I sat in meetings. I fixed the same problems I'd been fixing for years. But I was somewhere else the entire time. My mind kept returning to that moment on the couch, to the feeling of his hand in mine, to the way he'd looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. At home, I tried to be present. I helped Carson with his reading. I listened to Maya talk about her friends and the drama unfolding in 4th grade. I made dinner on the nights when Elise worked late. I folded laundry. I paid bills. I performed the rituals of normalcy with mechanical precision, hoping that if I did them well enough, they'd feel real again. But Elise knew. Of course she knew. She'd been watching me for weeks, maybe longer, seeing the distance grow between us even when we were in the same room. She'd given me space, waiting for me to explain what was happening. But her patience was wearing thin. It came to a head on a Tuesday evening. The kids were at her parents' house for a sleepover. Jonah had gone out. Something about needing air, needing to drive, needing to not be in the house for a while. It was just the two of us, Elise and me, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table like strangers in a negotiation. She'd made coffee. Neither of us was drinking it. The mug sat between us, steam rising in thin wisps, disappearing into nothing. She spoke first. Her voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the hurt underneath it. We need to talk about what's happening. About you. About us. I wanted to tell her everything was fine. I wanted to use the same deflections I'd been using for weeks. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The lies felt too heavy to carry. I told her I didn't know what to say, and it was true. How do you explain to someone that you've been living half a life? That the person they married was only part of who you really are? She leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her mug, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to grief. You're here, but you're not here. You haven't been for a while now. And I keep telling myself it's work, or stress, or just life getting harder. But it's not that, is it? I shook my head. No, it's not that. She waited, giving me space to continue. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how to put into words what I was only beginning to understand myself. She asked me if it was about Jonah. Her voice didn't accuse. It just asked. Simple and direct. I looked down at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the small scratch near the edge where Carson had dragged a toy truck too hard one afternoon. I focused on that scratch like it could save me. I told her I didn't know. And then I told her yes. And then I told her it was more complicated than that. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, sadder. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you are when he's around. You're different. You're more yourself. Or maybe you're someone I don't know. I can't tell anymore. The words cut deeper than anger would have. Because she was right. I was different with Jonah. I was someone I'd never allowed myself to be with her. Not because I didn't love her. I did. In the way you love someone who's been part of your life for so long they've become woven into the fabric of who you are. But it wasn't the same. It had never been the same. She asked me the question I'd been avoiding. The one I'd been too afraid to ask myself. Do you love him? I didn't answer right away. I sat there with that question hanging between us, feeling the weight of it pressed down on my chest. If I said yes, everything would change. If I said no, I'd be lying to both of us. Finally, I told her the truth. I told her I thought I'd always loved him, that I'd spent 15 years trying to bury it, trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be, that I'd built this life thinking it would make those feelings go away, but they never did. They just got quieter. And now Jonah was back, and I couldn't pretend anymore. Elise's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She just nodded slowly, like she'd already known and was just waiting for me to admit it. She asked me what I wanted, what I actually wanted, not what I thought I should want or what would hurt the least number of people, what I wanted for myself. I told her I didn't know, and I meant it, because wanting something doesn't make it right, because choosing one thing means destroying another, because there were children upstairs whose lives would be torn apart by whatever decision I made. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I didn't know. I'd known since that night in the basement when Jonah's hand touched mine. I'd known maybe even before that, in the weeks when his presence had become the only thing that made me feel alive. I knew what I wanted. I was just terrified of what it would cost. Elise stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the swing set I'd built, at the life we'd made together. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I won't make you choose. I won't give you an ultimatum. But you need to figure this out, Adrian. You need to decide who you are and what kind of life you want to live. Because us existing in this limbo where you're half here and half somewhere else, I can't do it anymore. The kids can't do it anymore. She left the kitchen. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. The bedroom door closing softly. Not a slam, just a click. Final and quiet. I sat there for a long time. The coffee went cold. The house settled into silence. And I felt the full weight of what I'd done. Not just in the last few weeks, but in the last 12 years. I'd married Elise knowing some part of me wasn't fully there. I'd had children thinking that responsibility would reshape me into someone who fit. I'd built this entire life on a foundation of denial, and now it was crumbling, and everyone I loved was going to get hurt in the collapse. When Jonah came back later that night, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. He took one look at me and knew something had happened. He asked if I was okay. I told him no. I told him Elise knew. I told him everything was falling apart. He sat down across from me, in the same chair Elise had occupied hours before. He didn't try to comfort me. He didn't tell me it would be okay. He just sat there, present, waiting. Finally, he asked me the same question Elise had asked. "What do you want, Adrian?" And this time, in the dark kitchen of the house I'd bought with my wife, with my children sleeping at their grandparents' house, with everything I'd built threatening to collapse around me, I told him the truth. I want to stop pretending. I want to know what it feels like to be honest about who I am. I want to stop living someone else's life. Jonah reached across the table. His hand found mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both understood what this meant, what I was choosing, what I was giving up. But even as I sat there, holding his hand in the dark, feeling something like relief mixed with terror, I knew it wasn't that simple. Because choosing Jonah meant destroying Elise. It meant shattering my children's sense of safety. It meant admitting to everyone who knew me that the person they thought I was had never really existed. It meant burning down everything I'd built to find out who I actually was underneath. I didn't know if I was brave enough. I didn't know if wanting something badly enough made it right to take it. I didn't know how to be the person I was becoming without destroying the person I'd been. But in that moment, with Jonah's hand in mine, I let myself feel it. The possibility, the truth, the terrifying freedom of finally admitting what I'd been denying for my entire adult life. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. But I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't unknow what I now knew about myself. I couldn't unfeel what I'd felt. The choice was made. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without consequences that would ripple out and touch everyone I loved. But it was made. In the silence of that kitchen, in the space between who I'd been and who I was becoming, I finally exhaled. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the breath felt like my own. The house is still now. Elise is upstairs in our bedroom, the door closed, the space between us measured in more than just distance. The kids are still at her parents' house. They'll come home tomorrow to a house that looks the same but isn't. To a father who looks the same but isn't. To a life that's about to shift in ways they're too young to understand. I should be up there with her. I should be trying to fix this, to salvage what's left, to find some way to make the breaking hurt less. But I'm not. I'm standing in the kitchen, staring at my wedding ring. I've been wearing it for 12 years. It's left an indent in my finger, a pale line where the metal has pressed against my skin day after day, year after year. A mark that will fade eventually, but not yet. Not for a while. I slip the ring off slowly. It resists at first, catching on my knuckle, and then it slides free. I hold it in my palm, feeling the weight of it. Such a small thing to carry so much meaning. Such a simple object to represent an entire life. I set it on the kitchen counter. Carefully, deliberately. Right next to the fruit bowl that Elise bought at a farmer's market 3 summers ago. The ring sits there, catching the dim light from the stove hood. A small circle of gold against the dark granite. I don't know what happens next. I don't know how we tell the children, or what Elise will say to her parents, or how I'll explain this to the people at work who've known me as one thing for so long. I don't know if Jonah and I will become what we're supposed to be, or if this will fall apart in different, unexpected ways. I don't know if choosing honesty over safety was brave or just selfish. What I know is that I can't put the ring back on. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I walk downstairs to the basement. The familiar path, the worn carpet on the stairs, the temperature dropping as I descend. Jonah is there, sitting on the couch in the dark. The console isn't on. The television is black. He's just sitting there, waiting. He looks up when I come down, and something passes between us without words. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that we've crossed a threshold we can't step back over. I sit down beside him, closer than I would have a month ago, closer than I would have even yesterday, close enough that our shoulders touch, close enough that I can feel him breathing. Neither of us speaks. There's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said. No more confessions, no more revelations, no more questions that need answering. Just this. 2 people sitting together in the quiet dark, suspended in the space between what was and what will be. The console sits unused. The controllers are exactly where we left them the night everything changed. This room has been our refuge, our excuse, our cover story. But it was never really about the games. It was never about nostalgia or reconnecting with the past. It was about finding a space where we could be honest when the rest of the world demanded we pretend. Jonah's hand finds mine in the darkness. His fingers lace through my fingers. It's not the first time we've held hands, but it feels different now. Less tentative, less forbidden. It feels like a beginning instead of a betrayal. I turn my head to look at him. In the dim light coming from the small basement window, I can just make out his profile. The line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the way his eyes are focused on nothing, or maybe on everything. He looks tired, but he also looks peaceful in a way I haven't seen before. We're not lovers yet. We're not free yet. We're not clear of the consequences that are coming. But we're here, together, no longer pretending that this is something it isn't. No longer hiding from what we both know to be true. I inhale, slowly, deeply, and for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, the breath feels complete. Like my lungs are finally allowed to expand all the way. Like there's no longer something constricting my chest, making me smaller than I actually am. The house above us is full of endings. But down here, in this basement where we've spent so many nights circling around the truth, something else is beginning. Something fragile and uncertain and terrifying. Something that might fall apart as quickly as it came together. But something real. Jonah squeezes my hand gently. I squeeze back. And we sit there together, two men in the dark, not yet knowing what the morning will bring. Not yet knowing how we'll navigate the wreckage we've created. Not yet knowing if we'll survive what comes next. But knowing, finally, who we are. And knowing that we've chosen to stop running from it. The console glows faintly in standby mode. A small green light in the darkness. Patient. Waiting. But we don't reach for it. We just sit here, breathing together, holding on to each other in the silence. Tomorrow, the world will demand answers. Tomorrow, there will be difficult conversations and hurt feelings and consequences that can't be avoided. Tomorrow, I'll have to face my children and try to explain something I barely understand myself. Tomorrow, everything will be harder. But tonight, in this basement, in this moment, there is only this. The truth. The acceptance. The terrifying relief of finally letting go of the person I was supposed to be and allowing myself to exist as I actually am. I don't know what comes next, but I know I can't go back. And for now, that's enough.